Alrighty. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays. I am your intrepid narrator pilot Fraggith, and today we will be reading more of Armor by John Steakley. Previously on, let's see. Not all is well or at rest in Sanction City. As we knew, it turns out one of the hecklers at the bridge when Jack Crow first got to Sanction is in fact in the employ of Borglin. There's a mysterious woman person, more on her later. And Hollie, the genius that he is, has figured out. Oh, right, and our protagonist, our current protagonist, our perspective character for the moment, Jack Crow, has met Lewis, the guy who owns the planet, and he's an eccentric drunk, it would seem. Um, and our resident genius Hollie has figured out a way to access the memories that the suit contains. One tiny problem. The only way to do this is to directly neural interface with the thing and experience everything that the previous wearer did firsthand, which will cause some feedback and possibly kill you. Certainly, it will not be fun. It could fry Hollie's brain, is the problem. And he's a genius, so that would be bad, apparently. I spelled Hollie Hollie in the description, but in the book it's Hollly. Whoops! I think I'll be forgiven. I forgive me. There. That's all that matters. And I forgive myself. So yeah, this week I believe we learn why Karen be the way she be. It is not a happy, scrappy story. Spoilers. Uh, not really spoilers. I mean, I think you can generally assume that this is not a happy, scrappy universe these characters live in. I think this is going to wind up being kind of short this week. Yeah, it's going to wind up being a little short, but it ends perfectly right at part 3 of the book. So, this is a good thing, ultimately. So, yeah, we're about to get back in it. Once I find my page again, someday. There it is. Yay! As I've alluded to before, I'm going to be. I just completely lost my brain. Finding it again. Oh my goodness, this is going to be one of those mornings. Hopefully, this book won't throw me any weird editing quirks, lapses in editing, like last week, which was just my brain hurt trying to suss out what was trying to be conveyed there. It's funny because I've read the book many times before, and I must have forced that entire segment from my brain. Um, so I apologize. It would have been real good if I hadn't. I think it was last week, not the week before. Yeah, it was last week. This is when he meets Lewis. Anyway, this is why you make sure your editor has read the entire book and made sure it all works. I don't place too much blame all around. It could happen to anyone, but man, makes reading it aloud problematic. Maybe later editions didn't have that. This isn't a first ed either, so there should have been no excuse. Um, I don't think this is a first ed. Maybe it is. Shouldn't be. Maybe. Whoa. At any rate, let's get cracking. Let me get some more water in me, and yeah, we'll things are gonna happen. Oh, right, and Jack Crow is feeling a certain degree of self-loathing. This will be a recurring theme. You've probably noticed that it is something of a recurring theme with him. He has baggage. More on that later. Honestly, that should probably be the title of the book, is Baggage, because it's kind of a recurring theme for literally everyone in the cast, except for a couple people. Just about everybody does, though, which is funny. Okay, it's not funny, but it's interesting funny. There, see? I can backpedal. Chapter 12. I had horrible dreams that night that lasted years. Not true nightmares, really, not at first, but very odd, in a macabre, intriguing sort of way. There were many distorted figures lodged and packed into a room that was at the same time ageographic. They and I stumbled around with staccato gaits, first winsome, then fierce, getting faster and faster until the whole thing resembled some sort of spastic frenzy. By then I knew it was a dream, but that didn't help. It was a commentary on me, the daytime me, the message seemed to be. It was about the recent me, the lately irrational, emotion-taught me. Other me's too, I supposed, but in any case, too damn many me's. It would only get worse. I would stretch to the frenzy. I would warp. So I woke up, fast as I could. Cortez was sitting beside my bed. He smiled when I opened my eyes, the lids of which felt puffy, ponderous. It seemed I'd been out 2 days with a raging fever. The muscular spasms had stopped hours before, now even. The local bug, in other words, had struck. "Welcome to Sanction," said Cortez with a wide grin, adding, "Didn't you feel it coming on?" I ignored him. I hadn't, of course, but, God knows, I should have. Idiot. It took me 8 days, a full local week, to get over it. Mostly I slept. Peacefully, for the most part. I did meet a couple of doctors, or maybe just one, as the only things I remember about either of them were youth, athletic postures, and greatly affected, pretend deep, bedside voices. Lia came often, cheerfully unconcerned for my welfare. "Everybody gets it," she reported gleefully. Hollie came twice, ever friendly but vague about progress with the armor. Cortez left only once, when Karen came. She hated being there, hated looking at me as I was. She was gone in minutes, again replaced by Cortez, who entered looking like the gossip I supposed he was. I ignored him, rolling over into my pillow for my hourly nap. I drifted off, wondering if I had not, in fact, learned more about her in those few anxious moments than in all of our previous hours. I thought I knew at last what she wanted from me. It was nice to be able to just sleep instead. I was sitting up smoking a cigarette on the morning of the 8th day when Lia came in and told me about the picnic. I didn't answer at first. I was still trying to get used to her appearance. I hadn't seen her in the past couple of days. She looked rotten. There were dark circles under her usually china pure eyes. She was somewhat pale as well, and her movements seemed a bit shaky, hesitant, and uncoordinated. worry. And only one thing could make that one worry. I was anxious to ask her about him, but I couldn't seem to get through her, "Let's be cheerful. If it kills us, me him." It was all for her sake, of course, though I doubted she was aware of it, and, to be sure, I got all the fussing over. Lia had been a Lia had a great time directing the expedition to the out of doors, insisting I be carried on a spring sheet by two attendants, one quite short, one quite tall, and laughing delightedly at the bouncing their mismatched gait gave me. It was, thankfully, a short trek, just 300 or so meters along the river bank to a grove of very earth-like trees. If it had been much farther, I'd have gotten out of the Springer and walked. I was still pretty weak, but I figured anything to be better than that bouncing seesaw. It was a beautiful, warm day. Bright sun and blue skies, the rains now long gone. It was a nice spot, too, beside a rancher's grazing stretching down from a low hill all the way to the edge of a clear, sparkling water. Oh, edge of clear, sparkling water. Damn, but it looked a lot like home. I was still looking for a chance to ask about Hollie, remembering that it had been quite a while since we had spoken. But before I got an opening, there was the milling about, spreading ground cloths and unpacking utensils and getting me propped. The attendants left then, only to be replaced by Cortez, face glistening with sunscreen. He was helped by Karen, of all people, with the carrying of the food and liquor. She smiled pleasantly at me, said hello, and the rest. She even went to the trouble to feel my forehead, a more token gesture than could be believed. Then she picked a spot a couple of trees away, cuddling up with a glass of wine and a shaded book screen, and looking, well, perfect. Others from the project wandered by, snatching bites of chicken and sips of wine, a long procession which was apparently planned, since there were ample stores for the long afternoon. At one point there were a good 3 dozen people gathered around us, chattering, gossiping, giggling. I was left pretty much alone, either in deference to my health, or in my notoriety, or, most probably, both. Just the same, I missed nothing, however juicy or dull. Lia, sitting beside me, was the favorite of all. Everyone stopped to chat with her. She charmed each of them individually and thoroughly, and made it look easy. She seemed to know everyone by name, for one thing, which was damned impressive. Particularly since most of those in attendance were crew, rather than the scientist types she was usually around. Occasionally I would break off from admiring the performance of Lia's social flair to check on Karen. Infinitely more beautiful than anyone else, and growing more so as the afternoon sun blazed multicolored in her hair, she was nevertheless left alone. It may have been her position that discouraged approaches. She was boss to most of those people, after all. Or, for all I knew, she had the reputation of a loner, or a bore, or even a bitch. But I didn't think so. It was her beauty. Curled up on the grass reading, a glass of wine in her hand, she was more painting than real. Her face, in classic profile, was unusually calm and serene, and framed with casual perfection by a few golden strands which had slipped free from the luscious hole flowing across her shoulders and halfway down her back. She was wearing a spotlessly white crew jumpsuit. It provided the fundamental thread linking the necessary contrasts of blue sky/eyes, blonde hair/skin, green grass/trees. The view was a painting. Angel descended among mortals. I was frankly grateful to be there at that instant, for all those who were not, however well or long they had known her, or would, had missed it. I could not imagine she would ever, in her strident life, manage to repeat that breathtaking image. It was her beauty that kept them away. It was intimidating. No woman could stand the comparison that side-by-side conversation would inevitably illuminate. And the men, how does one approach and disturb the angel in repose? Even should he wish to crack the crystal? Look, touch not. And everyone, to be sure, looked. The gathering about Laia stirred constantly with the oft-repeated turning of heads. The women snatched, or rather sneaked, glances, brief, probing, envious. Some of the men followed suit, not wishing to be obvious, but many didn't care. They simply arranged themselves so that she was in easy view, and thereafter rattled conversationally along with the people they never saw. I leaned against my pillowed throne and did some serious staring of my own. Unmistakably Karen, but still so unlike her. It was her. It just wasn't her life. If you could see this from my eyes, I wondered at her, the admiring hosts, the idyllic setting. If you could see you as I see you now, would it help? Would it reinforce your faith? Would it revive sinking dreams and hope? Or do you hate the beauty that has helped make your life just so? I never could decide. No way to tell, of course, but I'd expect some of each. It would have cheered her, even thrilled her, to have seen herself then. It would have had to. It was simply too lovely. But afterwards, with time and doubt leaning so heavily on the memory, and with that placidly desperate struggle of her versus her, and some hate did exist, I felt certain, for the beauty, for the brand of having it. I shook my head, shook it again. I found that I was no longer even looking at her, hadn't been in a while. The sun was no longer framing, and she had moved position a little. Christ, I thought, has it come to this now? Too much wine and bug-eating drugs and afternoon sun and... Guilt was still about, too, still leading me away from the point. I shook my head a third time. Most of the party had wandered off. 2 hours or so of sunlight remained. It was still pleasantly warm. Laia was encouraging, gently, the departure of her final moth, a stoutly muscular Asian woman seeking inside influence for a transfer back to her old position in the Project Dome galley.
The agritechs know nothing about food,
She complained in a shrill whine that had been installed, no doubt by mistake, in that massive chest.
they hate everything I fix.
From the way she strove to suppress a giggle, Laia was hardly surprised at this piece of news. Clearly, she found both the issue and the woman hilarious. But somehow she maintained her composure until at last free of the cook, sending her marching robot-like down the bank, short, thick arms held firmly immobile at her sides. Laia collapsed into helpless laughter before the cook had gone 20 meters. She jammed her peals of laughter against the corner of one of my pillows to muffle the noise. It was a compassionate gesture, and more than a little comical in itself. When she had resumed some semblance of control, she turned to me. I beat her to it. "Let me guess," I said. "You're the one who had her moved out of the dome in the first place." She looked surprised, but nodded. A pixie's grin curled up.
Worst cook in the world,
she said. And then the laughter bubbled out again.
she cooks like she looks,
she added before collapsing once more into hysterics, now unmuffled and bell-like. Laia laughed so long and so hard she cried. I found that I was laughing as well after a few seconds, so joyous was the sound. Cortez, asleep for hours, broke off his gentle snoring abruptly. He sat up, rubbed his eyes.
"What's so funny?"
he asked sleepily. Then, without waiting for an answer to that question, a wise move since it had only started Laia off again, Cortez asked another. "Anything left to eat? I'm starved." He followed this by immediately rummaging through the stores, opening and closing food seals. Still half asleep, he was spilling everything. I lifted my leg to avoid a stream of some sort of purple fruit juice. Laia, now relatively calmed, sighed, half smiling at his childlike grogginess. I groaned audibly, having little of her tolerance and even less of her tact. After some 4 hours of garden party gobbling, I had yet to have my private moment with Liah, and I refused to cater to this sloppy sleepyhead on top of that. Cortez, I said as calmly as I could, there's no food, no more wine either. Why don't you run fetch some? He frowned, scratched his head. Now? I'd have to go all the way down to storage. I don't know why. I cleared my throat. Let me rephrase that, Cortez. Let me rephrase that. Cortez, you will run and fetch the wine. Dig. Huh? Understand? I quickly amended. He stared at me, at Liah, who was suppressing yet another giggle, and nodded. Yeah, he said. I'll be right back. Take your time, I added quickly. Don't run. Liah smiled at his retreating form. She sat up, stretching her arms over her head and yawning. She looked around. Is that about everyone? She asked. I pointed to Karen, still absorbed with her reading. Must be some story, I offered. She'd do that a lot? Liah shrugged. I've no idea, she replied coolly, thus establishing, for my future reference, her lack of any connection with the other woman. I see, I replied, no less editorially. But Liah didn't bite. The subject had already been dropped. Fine with me. I was plenty ready to get on with something else. Now, I began, what's wrong with Hollie? She sobered visibly, her shoulders stiffening. Is it the suit experiment? The look of concern on her face managed to both age her and compliment her at the same time. It reminded me of her depth and her value.
Jackie doesn't know what he's doing, she blurted.
Pretty bright chap, you know, I countered easily. He's an expert at this sort of thing.
Nonsense, she replied firmly. No one's an expert at this. This is theory, Jack, and new theory at that. It's never even been thought about seriously before, much less attempted.
You've tried to get him to stop, have you? She glanced at me briefly, then away. She nodded. And he wouldn't budge, would he? She met my eyes. I smiled. Only on this, I added. She smiled reluctantly in return.
How did you know that?
I shrugged. Well, I knew you ran the rest of it. She made a face, looking embarrassed, and, of course, damned proud. I sighed and leaned back against the pillows. I fished a cigarette out and took my time about lighting it. She watched and waited. Finally, I'll try it if you want, Liah. I'll talk to him.
Would you?
She asked, just as if she were really surprised at the offer. Of course I will. Only, I wouldn't count on much.
But he thinks a lot of your opinion, Jack, she assured me.
I blew a smoke ring. Funny, if I were as smart as him, I'd never give me a thought. She smiled broadly, placating.
Well, Hollie is that smart, and he listens to you. You know he does.
I nodded. I do, but I don't know why. He doesn't know anything about me.
Of course he does.
I shook my head. Jack Crow stories don't count. We're talking about me. She tilted her head to one side, as though she couldn't believe her ears. But her voice remained amused.
Well, now, what happened to the smooth talker? Is this a confession or what?
I laughed. Well, I've been sick, I replied pitifully, and we both laughed. Okay, I said at last. I'll go see him before we eat. He's been working at it all this time?
She nodded. Ever since the night you got sick, he's worked on nothing else. He doesn't even go over the departmental records.
You know, Liah, I offered, that's really a good sign. Probably means he's discovered something.
Or thinks he has, she retorted bitterly.
I laughed. Where's your composure all of a sudden? She was not amused.
Where is his, Jack? What's the hurry?
I shrugged. He's on the scent. She shook her head, stared at the grass. Too fast. Too fast for us, maybe, but
Too fast for anyone, Jack. I don't care who it is.
I took her shoulders in my hands and turned her toward me. I looked into her eyes. Who is it? No, sorry. Who it is, Lia, I said firmly, is Hollis Ware, a genuine genius, an upper mind.
Unhand that woman, you drunk!
We spun around together to find the real drunk, the scream-singing fisherman Lewis, standing in the grass a few steps away from the water's edge, holding a fishing pole in one hand and the inevitable jug of Syntho in the other. He was soaking wet. Lia and I looked at him, then at each other, and burst into laughter. All the tension was forgotten with the sight of that idiot standing there dripping water. And the hat he wore! I couldn't imagine where he had gotten it. I wondered idly if it was made of real straw. He ignored our laughter, stomping up to us in a shower of droplets and peering down with mock theatrical disapproval.
While the cat's away, huh? He accused.
I noticed I still had my hands on Lia's shoulders. I dropped them quickly.
Too late, Crow, he snarled, pointing a finger. I have already seen enough. You, he yelled at Lia, making her jump. You scarlet woman, you!
Lia tried to look penitent, but couldn't keep a straight face. Lewis shook his head in disgust.
That's it, laugh, you hussy! And you!
I jumped on cue.
You know what Hollie Ware's gonna do to you when I tell him what I've seen?
No, sir, I replied meekly.
He's gonna take you into some corner somewhere and...
He broke off, thought a moment.
And think you to a bloody pulp.
He straightened up, tilting his hat back on his head. He noticed Karen.
Now what have you done? My God, this girl has died reading.
I followed his gaze, saw that Karen had fallen asleep in front of her little screen. Something landed on my lap. I looked down. A wet fishing pole. Lewis plopped to the ground behind it. He eyed me narrowly. He was very drunk.
Didn't catch fish one, he reported miserably. Fell in the river to boot.
Maybe you're not drinking enough, I suggested blandly.
Yeah, like you.
Me? I protest that. I held up my glass of wine. What do you call this? Lewis snorted, unconvinced.
A smokescreen is what I call it, or propaganda. Nope, just make that prop. That, Mr. Crow, is a stage prop. I'd take a phony beard more seriously.
I sighed. Okay, I give. Get to your point, O great fisherman without fish. He took a deep breath and, taking great care to pronounce each word clearly, said,
Point is, Crow, that you're not, among the many things you're not, a serious drinker. You are a pretender.
He broke off, relaxing, and nudged Lia with his shoulder.
Did you notice how well I enunciated that?
Lovely, replied Lia gravely. He seemed delighted.
You really think so?
Absolutely, Lewis. He smiled broadly.
Want to hear it again?
That reminded me. Lewis! You are Lewis, aren't you?
Course I am. What'd you think?
I mean, you're the same Lewis that runs this place. He shrugged.
Nobody runs this place that I know of.
He paused, took a sip from his jug.
I do, however, own this rock. Have for a long time.
He turned again to Lia.
Raised it from a pup. Boulder to you. Yep,
he continued, patting the turf fondly beside his leg.
Boulder first, then he became,
Bigger? Lia offered.
Right.
He nodded. He eyed her with scrutiny.
Hey, you know an awful lot about this sort of thing for a hussy. So where was I? Oh yeah, boulder. Then a bigger boulder. All easy so far. But next comes the toughie when he got to be an asteroid. He shook his head. Ugly, ugly stage in life, let me tell you, is that adolescent asteroid period. No respect at all, no values.
But with a will of iron, broke in Laia, and the determination of a god.
Lewis looked delighted. Golly, that's pretty. Oh, yeah, with iron will and the determination of a god.
He paused, right index finger poised.
I did it.
Laia clapped her hands. Hooray! At last!
The suspense was wrecking me, I remarked. Smart ass, sneered Lewis without rancor. Smart ass pretender drinker. I turned to Laia. Do I feel a challenge in the air?
She smiled. Could be.
Take your hands off my air, growled Lewis, and accept, damn it.
What do I get when I win?
He frowned. That's if you win, I believe.
Whatever. What do I get? Lewis reached for my cigarettes, lit one.
Why, the fish, of course. What the hell else?
I shook my head as if to clear it. I think I'm having a relapse.
No excuse.
Then what have fish got to do with... We are talking about a drinking contest, aren't we?
When you can keep up.
Then what have fish got to do with that? He exhaled a long stream of smoke.
Everything, dummy. That's how you tell who won.
How?
We don't just drink, Crow, he said impatiently. We drink and fish.
At the same time? Laia asked.
Hell yes. Drink till you catch one.
You've been doing that without Jack, Laia pointed out.
True, Lewis admitted, but not fish drinking. That was celebration drinking.
What were you celebrating? She asked.
My last fish.
How long ago was that? He sneered at her.
Hussy.
He stood up abruptly, swaying. He seemed confused. What's wrong? Asked Laia, concerned. He scratched his head.
Can't remember. What was I about to do a bit ago?
How many guesses? I asked. Lewis shook his head.
No, really.
Challenge Jack? Offered Laia.
Did that.
Tell about raising the planet? I suggested.
Did that.
Laia winked at me. How about stagger around dripping water?
Doing that,
said he and I in unison, and the three of us laughed. Lewis cut short his laughter ahead of us with, Aha! Aha what? Prompted Laia. He grinned, pointed in the direction of Karen.
Aha, I'm gonna see what Aha, I'm gonna see what read this girl.
Oh, what read, sorry. Problems with English. I swear to God, if I ever get a time machine, I'm going to go back to the wee bugger who thought that spelling read and read the same way was a good bloody idea. I don't appreciate it. That's what he says. He grinned, pointed in the direction of Karen.
Aha, I'm gonna see what read this girl to the grave.
And he stepped awkwardly over me toward her. I turned to Laia, getting to my feet. About ready to go in? She nodded. I started to gather up the mess around us. Her hand on my arm stopped me. I looked at her and saw that the tightness had returned to her features. I was amazed at how temporary an effect all the laughter had had on her capacity to worry. I squatted down beside her. Jack, she began. I cut her off. Laia, would you stop fretting? But you will talk to him. I said I would, and I will. Relax. Ollie's a big boy. But Jack, she said, her eyes pleading, he's taking such a terrible risk. I sighed, patted her arm. Well, he hasn't taken it yet. But he had. We heard Cortez's screams a second after that. He was bounding toward us across the meadow, slipping and sliding, falling once, waving his arms. We rushed to meet him. Through his panting and hysteria, he managed to get out that Hollie had been discovered lying unconscious on the laboratory floor, babbling incoherently. He was clutching some sort of plastic skull cap or something with all sorts of tubes and wires running out of it. Nobody had been able to pry his fingers loose from it. A seizure, the doctors had said. Catatonic. Laia was already running back to the dome before hearing all that Cortez had to spout. Karen, now wide awake, sprinted athletically after her. I gave it up after about 100 meters. Damn bug still had a piece of me. I had to slow up to wait for Sanction to stop spinning. Lewis appeared beside me, looking benignly helpful. "Here you go, Jack." "Here you go, Jack," he said, and offered a shoulder. He was a good crutch, in considerably better shape than most drunks I had seen. But even with his help, it seemed to take forever to cross the field, enter the dome, and work our way down into the lab. All the time, the thought kept streaking through my mind that Hollie, with his genius fried, would now be nothing more than the timid lad he had at first seemed to be. As we stepped through the seal, I heard Hollie's voice. He was sitting up on the workbench, surrounded by nervous faces. I broke loose from Lewis and rushed ahead to see him. Hot damn! He was alive, anyway. "No, really, really," he was saying to them. "I'm fine. A little weak, but—" He noticed my stumbling approach. "I'm okay, Jack," he assured me with a smile that contained equal parts shyness and pride. I was still worried. "I can see that. You look great, but—" How to put the next question? He anticipated me. "It's still me, Jack." He turned to Laia, putting a weary arm around her shoulders. "Really, it's still me. I'm fine, just a little tired." The doctor was reading a gauge off a medigrip attached to Hollie's other arm. "You're considerably more tired than that, Doctor. You're near physical exhaustion." He pulled one of Hollie's eyelids up with a thumb and scanned the pupil underneath. "And emotionally drained as well, I'd say." Hollie nodded vaguely. "Well, maybe he began before pitching forward into Laia's arms, out cold. The doctor was quickly reassuring. "He's all right," he said to Laia. She looked about to faint herself. "Are you sure?" The doctor nodded, gestured toward his gauges. "I'm sure. Just worn out, like I said. He'll be all right with plenty of rest and care." "He'll get that," asserted Cortez importantly. "I'll see to it." Laia smiled at him. "Thank you, Cortez. That's very sweet of you. Why don't you start right now?" She nodded at Hollie's still form, still crumpled between her and the tabletop. Cortez stepped to her side, and the bunch of them managed him into a prone position. Sorry. I had to get a drink of water, and now I have to find where I left off. She nodded at Hollie's still form, still crumpled between her and the tabletop. Cortez stepped to her side, and the bunch of them managed him into a prone position. Laia stepped back. "Thank you, everybody," she said to us, "for showing such—" She froze at the sight of something over my shoulder. We all turned around. Lewis was still standing at the entrance of the seal. His face was hard as stone, his muscles drum tight. He was staring at the black scout suit which had been propped into a sitting position in a chair beside the workbench, wires and tubes streaming outward. Laia took a step toward Lewis. "Lewis, are you all right?" He turned slowly at the sound of her voice. He raised a trembling arm and pointed at the suit. "What is that?" "That's a scout suit, Lewis. Hollie's been using—" That's war shit!" he shouted, livid with rage. "What's it doing here?"
"But, Louis,"
protested Lia meekly, clearly unnerved by the incredible transformation of personality.
"you knew this was a fleet proj—"
"I knew you were in Fleet. I didn't know you were Fleet, God damn it!" He turned and stared at us, fury and disgust rippling his features into a fist. Then he walked out. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then came the collective sighs, and all was activity again. Lia hovered over Hollie, mumbling rapid-fire questions the doctor gamely answered. Karen strode to the intercom and ordered a Springer team to the lab and intensive hookups for Hollie's sleeping quarters. Cortez and a couple of techs began clearing a path through the electronics for the Springers to better reach the bench. I sat down heavily in a chair and lit a cigarette and pondered. I took the opportunity moments later to add my superfluous assurances to those Lia had already heard while Hollie was being loaded. Then I managed to evade questions put to me by the curious and morbid stopping by out of rumor. When Hollie and most of the rest had gone, I stayed and talked briefly with the doctor, learning nothing new. Then, when he was gone, I helped the techs guess what should and should not be keyed off in the lab during Hollie's absence. When they left, I was alone. And so, with Hollie safe in his bed and surrounded by professional concern and layman's good intentions, I found the chance to betray him. In all the confusion, I was sure to have several minutes alone with the security systems. It was a rotten act to take advantage of him that way, but perhaps no worse than the act of sabotage itself, which took a surprisingly short time. A half hour later, only I knew how helpless Hollie really was. More still. She was waiting in my suite when I got back, flushed still with the excitement and the running and the point of being there.
"How dare you leave me in there the other night?"
she began, clutching my arm furiously. Mad, guilty, upset too much, I clamped my fist around her upper arm to jerk her away, clamped too hard, and she moaned with the sudden pain, and our eyes met, and her lips parted, and I knew what our point really was, as I had known for some time. This was it. Strength on her. The clamping fist, anger, and muscles together. Brute from me. And she screamed when I threw her down and was upon her, ripping at the spotlessly white crew jumpsuit, and she struggled and kicked but writhed too. She surged into it. Maybe I did too. But both of us fell toward it, scratching and clawing and clutching, and it got very, very rough. Perfectly awful / awfully perfect. And then laid flat out, pinned and twisting, blood seeping from her nose and a shiner coming on and screaming at me for begging me to make her beg and please, oh please, yes, yes, tell her over and over what she really was. She loved to hear me tell her what she really was. And I did, but damned if I really knew, either of us. It was spectacular and all-encompassing, and it racked through me, shocking, stunning bolts of pleasure and pain. Both of us beating on her, abusing her, degrading the angel's exquisite form, and, yes, the angel herself, and, of course, whatever was left of both of us, and always, always so damn rich with rippling ecstasy. So damn good, somehow. So damn rich. So horrible. Eventually, mercifully, we slept. In the nick of time. Chapter 13. He had no faith. Hollie said it like he still couldn't believe it was true. He looked at me with all the wide-eyed incredulity of a child learning for the first time that fair has nothing to do with the real world. Shocked, hurt, more than a little frightened. Angry, too, and morally indignant, demanding an explanation. I had none. None, anyway, that would do any good to him right then. So I changed the subject. I thought you said you couldn't read the guy's mind. I couldn't. Not really. I mean, I couldn't tell when he was going to move until he moved, or what he was going to say until he said it. But I felt it when it happened. It was so close, so intimate. You mean emotions? I persisted. You could read those? Not read them, he replied carefully. Feel them. Or rather, feel him feeling them. I glanced across the bed to Laia for some reaction. No luck. She sat as she had for the entire hour I had been there, hunched over forward in her chair, with her elbow propped on her knee, her chin propped in her palm, and her eyes staring dead blank at the floor. The only signs of animation came when she put out one cigarette in order to light another. But she was listening. Her face was drawn so tightly across her cheeks that it looked like it should hurt. Yay, automatic messaging from robot. Here we go. Her face was drawn so tightly across her cheeks, it looked like it should hurt. I shifted back to Hollie, looking skinny and out of place against the vast expanse of linen. Oh, double speed. I'm going to throw this man for a loop. I'm so sorry. Even his bedclothes dwarfed him, ignoring all but his broadest gestures. He was constantly having to drag his huge collar around to match the motions of his neck. Sorry. I apologize. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. I realize that's going to be on a minimum of 5 minute delay, but whatever, it was worth it. Or you! I shifted back to Hollie, looking skinny and out of place against the vast expanse of linen. It's not a 5 minute delay, I'm shocked. Even his bedclothes dwarfed him, ignoring all but his broadest gestures. He was constantly having to drag his huge collar around to match the motions of his neck. And there was a lot of motion there. His eyes darted constantly about the room. From the ceiling to the walls to Laia to me and back again, pausing only when he had trouble choosing the right words. Then he would stare at the palms of both hands held plaintively before his face like twin view screens, and his eyes would glaze, and he would be back there, in the suit, in the war. It was particularly eerie. He wasn't away long this time. He dropped his hands on his lap. He had no faith, he said again, the same way as before. I nodded, exactly as if I had any notion whatsoever. Well, I've got to run, I lied, standing up. See you tomorrow, Hollie. Laia. Something in my uneasiness must have leaked through. Hollie looked up at me this time for the first time. Yes, that is how it reads. Hollie looked up at me this time for the first time. No, Jack. He glanced at Laia. Tonight. Can you come back tonight? I noticed Laia watching me too. I nodded. Tonight it is, I said, and scooted too quickly out the door. I hurried through the seals outside, where the sun was shining and the sky was earth blue and lovely, where there were horses and cattle things on the meadows surrounding the western edge of the dome. The guards on the bridge smiled at me and waved and said something unintelligible but nice. I took all of this in and relished it, filled my lungs with it. Got all the way across the bridge, sat down at the far end of it, and got my cigarette lit before I let myself think. On the other hand, I told myself furiously, Hollie could be simply stunned, instead of the vegetable he appeared to be. Or maybe he was just stark raving mad, an improvement over being a carrot, anyway. Shit. Or maybe it was just my usual guilt funk dripping those pitiful images. I made a command decision. I decided to forget about it. Hollie was just tired out and a little disillusioned, that was all, by the reality of war versus the flag waving. Okay? Okay. Besides, I was busy with traitor business. I had to see Weiss. I walked across the sewer bridge into the city. It was its usual teeming, desperate self. People stomped or strolled or wandered about looking for spots to hide what little bits of their past lives they had dragged through the staggering jolt of getting this far. The maze was dry now, but miserably pockmarked with hundreds of hard and dusty footprint craters. I limped and tripped alongside everybody else on my way to Weiss's passage. I was about halfway up the gradually ascending length of it, in about a tenth of the time it had taken me before in the rain and darkness and despair. It was more than just the physical conditions which made this day different, however. There seemed to be a new touch of something in the air, crisp and clean and hopeful, maybe, the way the people clamored about. Like the rain had washed something away, and what was left was good and purposeful and so feeling poetic and the like. I got a little careless. A guy came suddenly hopping out of a narrow side tunnel, moaning in pain and fluttering his right hand in the air. Damn! 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 He said to himself, and then, apparently seeing that he wasn't alone, to me, then he stopped his hopping long enough to hold his left thumb up and examine it critically. It was purple, and, I assumed, yes, assumed, it was swelling. Can you believe it? He asked. This is the fourth damn time. I smiled, partly because of the way I was feeling and partly because of the way the guy was. Oh, well, that's not his voice, so you're going to hear something different in a minute. Nice looking man. Big, broad-shouldered, with long black hair that was maned, squared off around his forehead. He was Oriental, Earth Orient, Earth Orient, that is. Let's try that again. Big, broad-shouldered, with long black hair that was maned, squared off around his forehead. He was Oriental, Earth Orient, that is. Earth Orient, that is. He had an easy, powerful voice. Seems like a lot, I agreed pleasantly. My dumbass helper, he added with a shrug in the direction from which he had appeared. Idiot has no grip whatsoever. He shook his head and sucked briefly on the purple digit. He grimaced slightly. I shrugged consolingly, made a step past him. Hey, he said, brightening. Can you give me a hand? It'll just be a second. Just help Idiot hold it in place long enough so that I can... And blah, 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 with me following him around the corner, and, sure enough, there was a corner of one of the local throw-togethers exposed with this huge piece of what looked like plasteel heat shielding resting beside it that looked to have been carved out to fit the hole. Up above on the second story was this little guy with red hair, the idiot, no doubt, leaning out of what had once been an escape hatch back during the time when this erector set used to be a starship. And it looked all right. The redhead was in a good position to hold the piece of plasteel if he leaned out the hatch, while the Oriental on the ground could brad it in tight. So I nodded and stepped forward, and the Oriental picked up one side, and I reached for the other, and the redhead stretched both arms down to get it, and then I noticed that it really wasn't plasteel at all. It was that plastiform crap that was so popular because it was cheap and looked like plasteel, and I thought, well, hell, he ought to be able to hold this with just one hand. And that's when the Oriental hit me. He was a big guy, and it was a damn good blow, a forearm to the side of my head. I went down flat. Then rolling away into position for the next shot, and then there was red hair flying through the air onto me out of that hatch, and he hit me as hard as the local gravity allowed for his fall, which was plenty, and before I got a good grip on him, or the Oriental who loomed over me, or anything else, the sun was blotted out by many others crowding in for a piece. The crowd worked well together, each getting a good grip on me and lifting me up off the ground, making me helpless, and, worse, making me know it. They hustled me around a corner, and then around a couple of others, the passage getting narrower and narrower until we stopped in this tight, square, claustrophobic little area surrounded on three sides by 3 stories of maze, crooked and ugly and seeming to lean in on us. They had me. Absolutely goddamn had me. No one broke his concentration or loosened his grip or looked like he was going to. 2 on each leg, 2 on each arm. One held the back of my head against his chest with 2 huge hands, the thumb of the left one painted purple. Shit. Shit, because they had me, really had me, and I hated, loathed, was repulsed, sickened by having hands on me without my consent. And double shit because I had been so utterly fooled, and, come to think of it, triple shit. Because not only did this group know how to handle itself against an enemy, they knew how to handle themselves against me. This wasn't a shakedown or a robbery or any other sort of thug mugging gang. This was the execution of a plan dreamed up by someone who used well-trained, or at least well-drilled, disciplined people who knew just how good I was and who weren't taking any chances. "Bring 'em here," said somebody I couldn't see. And they did. All 18 legs of them spiraled around so that I might face the man who had spoken. He stood on a jutting piece of web form a couple of meters over our heads. He looked about 50, which meant nothing, of course. Still, I had the impression that his appearance was natural, non-cosmetic, which would have made him a couple of decades younger than me. But I only noticed those details in passing, the way I noticed his well-worn tunic and his beard and the unusually long, thin fingers on the hands hanging clasped before him. For beside him stood Eyes, clean now and, amongst her folk, safe. Long brown hair tucked into something functional. Legging things on the legs of her pants. Simple tunic like her father's. Was it her father who stood at her side? I never found out. She looked strong and capable and lovely and well worth the fighting that had gone on for her sake. Still Eyes, too. Hers shone in the sun. "You must forgive us," began their leader, opening his hands in an expression of regret, "for having treated you in this fashion, but your somewhat lethal reputation has preceded you." "Is that supposed to be an apology?" I snarled. "It is. That the best you can do?" He stiffened. So, in fact, did a couple of the ones holding me. Eyes, I noticed, showed no reaction at all. She was still waiting. "I assume," he began again, "that your statement implies release." He paused, wiped his brow clear of a lock of sandy gray hair with one of those long fingers. "Quite understandable, of course," he resumed. "Even reasonable under normal circumstances." Those hands clasped together again, and he peered forcefully into my eyes. "You, sir, are hardly normal circumstances, even for us. If I were to have you set free, how many of your captors would be killed or maimed or otherwise handicapped before they could get free?" I grinned, shrugged. "3." He nodded. "At least 3, Mr. Crow. At least." His hands separated again, palms upward. "So you see how my hands are tied." I laughed. I had to. So, apparently, did everyone else. At the absurdity of the situation. And at our own, each and every one of us. So bizarre. So often. Eyes, sparkling, laughed herself beautiful. I forced my thoughts and my feelings and me away from the idea of that. The leader had resumed. "Do hope you won't be too uncomfortable while I say what little I have to say. In any case, I—" "Get on with it!" I snapped, hating Buddy Buddy while being held. That cooled him off instantly. We all got a lot more tense. The muscles on the hands that held me grew more taut. Good. This was not fun, damn it. "Very well, Mr. Crow," said the leader stiffly. "I shall indeed get on with it. First, let me tell you a little bit about who we are." He spread his hands wide to indicate not just the immediate throng, but the city itself. And then he gave a speech. It was a pretty good one, and he didn't ease up much either. He really did tell me who they were. And what. They were crewmen and women from the starships. They were crewmen and women from the starships, or couples with girls and boys of draft age, or merchants fleeing the growing restrictions of wartime. They were societies against the loss of something or other. They were people who had been pushed off into the unknown, one step ahead of fleet expansion, or 2 steps ahead of prison. They fled the loss of freedom, the courts, their wives or husbands, their past. Most simply fled the Ant War. Quite a few were deserters. Each had, or had been, deserted. So they crashed their shuttlecraft in the gorge or entire ships along the flatlands under the shale bluffs. Sometimes they left their empty ships in orbit. Sometimes the same orbit. The rare night flashes of colliding bulkheads were the sources of much amusement, as well as a small monthly lottery. Many, many died. Many had lived, though, and those folk hung together. Raw and bleeding and desperate, they tacked the tortured metal together and hammered at the bulkheads and welded and strained and fought and lived. Outer hulls became outer walls. Airlocks became doors. First one battered ship became 2 battered ships, and then 3, and then 4. Beside it, another equally ugly configuration began to grow the same way, and then another, and another. The first clearing opened into another outer one, and so on until there was formed the maze, the maze, the maze of dirty, heat-blasted metal and plasteel through which trod an ever-growing horde. The streets were almost always muddy, so, usually, were the people. Primitive hydroponics kept them alive. Then came other things. And though they were never fully organized in any formal sense, bosses had appeared to make the attempt. The tough guys didn't last long. They rose up and seized control for a while until stabbed or blazed or beaten to death by one-time clerical assistants or pharmacists or third-class drive techs who had come a long way to be rid of such men and would damn well not accept them now. There were major setbacks and major villains, but each and all were vanquished, trod into the mud of the maze by a deeper, mightier vitality that came from desperation and the will to live. Soon it was just a naked force bigger than the sum of its parts, bigger and stronger and, somehow, more mature, ready, at last, to evolve into something else, a city. And then, I said, interrupting, came Weiss. The leader broke off his rhetoric and eyed me narrowly. After a moment he nodded. Yes, he said, Weiss and his band of animals. And now the whole process has begun all over again. I snorted. The people seemed behind him on the bridge a few weeks back, against the project director, no less. The people don't understand him. They don't know what he is. They don't see what you want them to see. There was a murmur of anger through the bunch holding me. A couple of them increased the intensity of their grips. Even the leader was affected. His poise busted at last. Weiss and his crew are a band of cutthroats and hoodlums who would do anything to take control and hold it. Anything! He stared angrily at me for several seconds before resuming. We know that you know Weiss, that you have dealings with him, but we had hoped that from what we had heard about you in the past and from... He glanced briefly at Eyes. And from other sources, that you were not the type of man to be helping such a brigand. Not if we could make you see what he was. If you only knew... If I only knew? I shouted, appalled. If I only cared, you mean? That froze him. He started to speak, stopped. Started to speak, stopped. He looked suddenly unsure, uprooted. He stared at me. But if... What do you... Finish this! I barked. One way or the other. He continued to stare at me a long time. No one else. The rest couldn't look. They looked away. But the leader seemed welded to me. Damn it, I knew what he was about. It made sense. Borglin gave me a ship. Weiss would hardly throw in for free. But who the hell was I to cut out his piece? I didn't blame this man. I didn't blame him or Eyes or his people. I wouldn't have stood for it either. They were right to oppose this sort of bullying. But god damn it, that didn't mean they were right. With a capital R. He broke the gaze at last. He looked at his feet. The long fingers intertwined, writhing incestuously. He looked pale and pitiful and... Damn him! Let him go, he said. They did. Reluctantly, then warily, then carefully. I made no moves when they set me down. I even gave them a chance to back away before standing. The leader hadn't moved. I looked at Eyes, saw she had gone. They were just Eyes now. So the previous times he said Eyes, it's with a capital E. I should have mentioned that. And this time it wasn't. Things that you'll get from actually getting a copy of the book and reading it as opposed to me narrating it. It's difficult to make an auditory distinction between those. Her eyes became eyes. Oh, there we go. The leader hadn't moved. I looked at Eyes, saw she had gone. They were just eyes now. But when she saw me looking at her, they returned. In anger and disgust, her eyes became eyes once more. And then I knew why they had affected me so. I saw the dreams in them then, the rightness, and, more importantly, the conviction, the willingness about the necessary risks, her life on the line. But I had already made all of those decisions, damn it. I wanted my ship. Gradually I became aware of movement all around me. I turned my head to see that everyone was leaving. The leader had already gone. Soon there were only the two of us left there, staring at one another. And soon after that, Only me. But not soon enough. For before she left, she said, in a way I refuse to recall, "So you're Jack Crow." Then she spat. Then she left. I wanted to kill her. I just stood there. It took me half an hour to find out that the passage I had chosen to lead me out was a dead end. I kicked the web of thermoflex blocking my path with a vengeance. I could have killed her then. I sighed, suddenly exhausted by my own anger, by the burdensome weight of it. A perfect day, I muttered, and turned back around. It took me another half an hour to reach the square once more. Only then could I think about finding Weiss's lair. His office had been straightened up somewhat, but he was the same old charmer. "What did you tell him?" he asked without preamble as I stepped through the door. "Fuck off," I replied evenly. "Is that a direct quote?" asked an unmistakably powerful voice from behind me, "or simply more evidence of your sparkling personality?" I spun on my heel and faced Borglin, momentarily stunned once more by the sheer enormity of him. A for-real giant. "Both!" I snapped, gathering together quickly, as I always seem to do in a pinch, my worst side. "Both!" I snapped, gathering together quickly, as I always seem to do in a pinch, my worst side. There we go. Borglin ignored my response, as he could well afford to. He motioned me to a chair and stood over me and talked strategy. And when the question came about the dome defense screens, I could have lied, said that it couldn't be done. I could have simply turned the question aside, as I had before with Weiss. But I didn't. "It's done," I replied. "They're helpless." Borglin didn't stay much longer after that, just long enough to thank me for what I had done so far, and to reiterate that what Weiss had said before about the uncertain timetable. He thought a couple of more weeks, but he couldn't be any more definite than that. Then he left. And why not? There was no need to stick around. He had what he wanted. He had gotten my assurance about the screens. And I had gotten the point of his being there, which was the knowledge that he could be there any time. On the way back to the project, I thought about what it had been like to have been hung in the air by those fat fingers of his, and I bristled, both at the remembered feeling of frustration and at the knowledge that it was just what Borglin would want me to think about. Chapter 14. Hollie wasted no time getting down to it. When I rang the secured seal to his lab, he opened it himself with the manual key, and then personally escorted me into his little briefing cubicle. There were several screens attached along the length of the conference table, each glimmering with rhythmically esoteric data. Lia was next door in an adjoining cubicle with a couple of screens of her own. She waved at me through the connecting window and flashed what I'm sure she thought was a cheerful and carefree smile. Her appearance was a considerable improvement over that morning, but the strain could not be hidden. Idly, I wondered why she should even try to hide it. "First of all," began Hollie after we had sat down, "I want to apologize for being so uncommunicative this morning. I didn't mean to be so obscure. It's just that I didn't know how to express what I was feeling. And well, I'm sorry about it." I grinned. "And what about scaring the shit out of me after the picnic? Not that I could care less if you burned out your brains, but the least you could do is try not to spring it on me." Jack Crow crap, but just the kind of compliment that Hollie adored. He flushed a little and grinned shyly and glanced down at his hands folded on the table before him. But all the boyishness was gone in the next instant as he continued.
Secondly, he resumed, I want to assure you that I'm fine. I was not harmed by the experience, however bad it may have seemed at the time, neither physically nor mentally. He sat forward, made a steeple out of his fingers, and peered intently into my eyes. I want to stress this, Jack. Every medico in the project has been over my numbers, and there's nothing wrong.
Nothing that they can find, anyway, I amended. He looked pained. He nodded reluctantly.
Yes, technically, yes. However, I can think of no intelligent reason why one should simply assume damage without evidence, do you?
I shook my head in response, amazed at the stern tone his voice had briefly assumed. A real director of project tone, that. Hollie seemed not to notice.
Thirdly, I want to report that the experiment was a success. Not only was it a success, but it worked better than I had hoped.
I frowned. Well, that's one way of looking at it. There is a little matter of the catatonia. He looked pained again. He started to speak, stopped, rethought. Then,
I'm getting to that, Jack, but let me take it step by step, please.
of course, I said pleasantly. Inside, I was thinking that there is nothing spookier than having someone stress to you how sane they are after having had a fit-like seizure a few days before. What Hollie did next was go over ground I knew already. Talked about how it was the magnetic drainage of the record pulses off the coil which had caused the problem in the first place. Reminded me why this prevented a screen from being used to view it. Next, he re-outlined how he hoped that, using his own little helmet and his own mind, a commonality to the two separate brainwave patterns could be artificially and temporarily induced. He had worried that it was either an impossible scenario to attempt the commonality at all, or that too much strain would result from the two different patterns conflicting in unison. But instead, a third thing had happened. A third field had been created between his pattern and the other. It had been this third field which had provided the channel of reception. And this was a real boon. For not only did it allow him to see what was going on, but it had also allowed him to retain perspective over the process. That's what you meant when you said you could feel him feeling his emotions? I prompted.
He nodded vigorously. Exactly. It gave me the immersion I wanted, but it also kept me a step back, prevented the possibility of psychological conflict.
Something conflicted, I pointed out.
He smiled wanly. Well, yes, there was a conflict of sorts, but not the kind that you and Liar had feared. It was not a conflict of psyche.
Then of what?
Of intensity.
He leaned back in his chair and sighed, spreading his hands on the tabletop.
It was simply too strong, even with the sense of detachment. Not that I felt I was being sucked in or anything, he was quick to add. It's just that the emanations were simply it's just that the emanations were simply too powerful. They caused an overload.
I thought a minute. Couldn't you simply turn it down? He frowned, shook his head.
We're on the lowest gain now. The trouble is, my helmet requires a certain minimum charge to function.
I nodded. I see the problem. He nodded in return, but rather unhappily.
There is one more possibility, however.
And that is? He looked reluctant.
Well, it could be that the intensity of reception is not due to the charge needed to power the suit. It could be that, well, it could be, finished Liar from the doorway, the fact that we are dealing with a very unusual man. A very unusual, highly dynamic man.
She walked over and sat down in the seat next to me. In her hand was a coil tape.
Battlefield conditions produce inordinate stress in anyone, but in Felix...
You know what his name is?
Was, yes. It was Felix, Hollie amended.
Was? I asked, surprised. You mean he died? Well, no wonder. No, said Hollie quickly. He didn't die on me. But you think he will? I persisted. Hollie's smile was grim. He nodded. I think so. In fact, he added, looking sad and very, very far away, I can't conceive of any other possibility. It was very quiet while we thought about that. Something in how Hollie had said it, something about the hopeless finality of it. Eerie. I caught myself staring out the window overlooking the main lab to the black suit propped into a sitting position alongside the main console. A menacing sight, sitting there just so. Menacing and sinister and... I tore my gaze away, shoving such thoughts roughly back into the shadows where they belonged. I cleared my throat. Well, I can see why you're stuck, Hall. Oh, we're not stuck, he jumped to add. But if you don't have any way to turn down the gain... We don't need to turn it down. There's another way to reduce the intensity. He glanced quickly at Laia, who met his gaze briefly, then looked away. A way to have it, in fact. What's that? I asked, stepping into it. They exchanged glances again. Hollie made a determined effort to sit up straight and look me in the eye. By adding another helmet and another experimenter. My mouth fell open. I closed it. So that was it. I was too stunned to do much more than nod through the following offer. That, and stare back and forth between their two intent faces, while they fell all over one another in their efforts to assure me that there was no reason to suspect that there would be any danger involved. Ha! There was more of the assurances. Then came the part about the great strides that could be made with such an experiment, reminding me that I had expressed interest in helping, and how this would certainly be of more help than anything else I could do. Oh, yes, there was a mention of payment from the extensive fleet funding. So, could I think about it tonight, and then let's talk again in the morning? I said I would think about it. Hollie couldn't let it be. He talked about how he thought he had hit on something terribly important, something he couldn't explain altogether, but something I would certainly understand when, that is, if I decided to take part. And how he would especially like to have me and only me in on this, how he'd like to keep this experiment just among the three of us, rather than involve others from the project. Then more assurances. I said I would think about it. Laia insisted on walking me to the seal. Still more assurances to start. Then Honey Bull. The tone of voice with its quiet intensity, its brave conviction, that look of, oh, I know I can trust you, Jack, you're so strong, where else can we turn? Complete with the soft pressure of her hand on the crook of my arm, and, incredibly, batting eyelashes. It was exactly the same crap she had used so effectively on me the day of the picnic, except then she had believed it. She had known what she was doing was right, had known her concern for Hollie was justified, had known my warmth for him was genuine and appropriate to call upon. She had known she was doing the right thing. Further, she had known what she was urging me to do was equally right. This time, she knew no such thing. She was lying with each and every well-chosen word. Why me? I kept thinking. Maybe it was the Jack Crow bit. Maybe she thought that I could just dive through the wiring feeds, running between us, and snatch Hollie by the scruff of the cerebellum and haul him out of a tight spot. Or maybe she just didn't want the other project people involved on sanction to know what a mad hatter her man had become. I said I would think about it. And I did, in a way. Once I calmed down a little with a brisk walk through the seals to my suite. Once I had gotten over the urge to slap Laia's sanctimonious holier-than-lesser sacrifice all for my man face. How dare that bitch screw up my head? I had experimented with the hallucinogens years, decades, before alongside the rest of my once contemporaries. Luckier than most on account of not really ever believing that this mental masturbation was the way, or the path, or whatever else they were calling it at the time. Seeing it, knowing instinctively that it was a brain teaser and nothing more. A trip for people who couldn't afford to travel. But even with that to back me up, there had been a time or two. So I knew better. Life was tough enough. Climbing down into that hole with Hollie and his tubes wasn't the same as the rushing chemical thrill. And maybe, well, probably, if Hollie felt so, there was something of great scientific value to be found. But it was that same hole, no matter how I got there. The hole where the creature lives, the monster, the fiend who comes terrifyingly quick, slipping up at you out of your out. That's why I'm having trouble because it's like six monosyllables in a row. Let's try this sentence again. But it was that same hole, no matter how I got there. The hole where the creature lives, the monster, the fiend who comes terrifyingly quick, slipping up at you out of the muck, grinding his teeth, popping his jaws eagerly, clawing at your clean flesh with gnarled hands sporting gritty black talons, and using your face to know where it hurts the most. Bullshit. And for somebody else to boot. A risk for another means sacrifice for another. And even if I wanted to, which I sure did not, where was I going to fit in? Too many risks already, wedged tight, and the jamming of it all still coming up. Madness. Cortez was nowhere in sight when I reached the suite. By now I knew what that meant. From the bedroom I could hear the faint hum of the fresher. Her clothing, crew jumpsuit, boots, and things, were piled in the corner of one of 4 chairs surrounding a small table. On the table itself sat her view screen. I wandered over to it, idly wondering what she read. A bit fretful, too, of finding something else I might have to live up to. The screen was off, but the tab was on, the reference sequence glowing softly and efficiently in red. I cringed. Fleet IDs are 15-digit numbers, and I had only seen this one once before. I hesitated, then pushed restart and found myself staring at the official fleet dossier of one John Jacob Jack Crow. I blinked, stared, stood there trembling. I felt invaded. I hadn't heard the humming of the fresher stop. Her voice from the bathroom door whirled me around. I had to know, she said in a small, apologetic voice. She leaned against the seal jamb as if for support, idly wiping at the remaining flakes with a towel. Had to know what? I growled, my voice hoarse. I had to be sure, she whispered intently, pleading. Sure of what? That you'd go through with it. Through with what? I began, and then, of course, I knew what she meant as I remembered what we both remembered. I knew as I saw the tears swell and slink and I knew as I saw the tears swell and sink and slide down that horrible purple bruise beneath her eye. I ordered food for 2 to be delivered to the outer room. We waited in silence until we heard it arrive. I went out to fetch it, blazing down Cortez's questioning look with a glance. I brought it back into the bedroom, wheeling the trolley up to the edge of the bed where she sat still wrapped in the towel. I pulled up a chair for me. And we ate. For close to 3 hours we ate. Usually there was far too much food brought to me. But not that night. I stuffed myself. Karen stuffed herself. We stopped. I smoked. She drank wine or simply toyed with the stem of the goblet. Then we ate some more, ravenously, almost desperately, until we could not take another bite. Then we stopped until we could, and always in silence. "Music?" she asked once, and I nodded, stood up, and keyed something neutral. It was the only word spoken between us the entire time. The music was a good idea. It gave us something to do. Oh, it gave us something to almost do while we sat between feasts. Sometimes we looked at each other. Not often. Over 2½ hours later, it was gone. Choked and still hungry, drunk and still thirsty. I stood up slowly, my head reeling with the wine, and went into the bathroom. There was nothing else to do. The feast was over. I stayed in there a long time. Too long, really, to be healthy. I felt skinned when I came out, but that wasn't so bad either. I didn't know if she would still be there or not. Didn't know what it meant either way. She was there, under the covers. Her hair was spread like dawn across the pillows. I noticed the music was gone and the lights were dim. My cigarettes had been placed on the bedside console. I got in beside her. She slid toward me, tucking in. After a while, perplexed by my inability to feel where my skin left off and hers began, I became a louse. Said something idiotic and provocative about seeing her dossier. Her answer was to lift her head and rest her chin on my chest and peer at me until I was forced to meet her gaze. Then she said, "I'll tell you anything you want to know." It was not a qualification. It was not defensive or evasive or in any way devious. I knew that. I knew it. But... "All right, goddammit, tell me about it," I dared, lighting a cigarette. And so she did tell me about it. All about it. I lay looking at the ceiling and seeing the pictures formed by her words and by the way the small of her back shuddered beneath my palm. Her voice was invariably gentle, timid sometimes matter of fact. There was bitterness, too, of course, and sadness and regret and wicked touches of irony, but never laughter. Not once that. A rich kid, happy little girl, wearing pinks and blues and whites because those were the favorite colors of her daddy. She wore black for the first time at 12, at his funeral. The vacuum time. No brothers or sisters. Only mother, who cried and drank in rooms with the lights out. Hope and a stepfather at 13. Raped at 14. No trial. Divorce instead. They moved. Moved again. A short remarriage. A long second divorce. Spectacularly beautiful at 16. A first fiancé. Another. Two more. At 17½, a husband. Mentally unbalanced, an exceptionally generous description. Long separation burdened by guilt but tinged throughout as well by brief flashes of genuine terror. Divorce, at last, followed on cue and as advertised by the tragedy, sick and loathsome and out of her hands, but still. His funeral left to her by his family, who begged and pleaded and then used her symbolic resumption of the role as an excuse to blame and accuse. Finishing school near the top of her class. Never any trouble there at any time, for she is bright and curious and somehow inherently hopeful. Joining Fleet a month later. A month after that, still in boot camp, raped a second time. Trial serves to both exonerate him and brand her as an angel-haired slut, a blatant lie but a common fantasy in the courtroom. Powerful military types crossing wires to get her transferred their way. When the last string is pulled, the last favor cashed, she finds herself on Capitol Earth, where she is promoted, pampered, and eventually raped again. There is no second trial. More promotions instead. and a transfer to Militar, itself hub of fleet. Corridors of power. Picking and choosing now. Not rape, not love, not enough. Her second military rapist, the general who spouted promotions, has died in the Ant War. He dies rich. Dies guilty, too, his will mentioning her a fleet scandal. Karen laughs at hushed whispers and gestures just out of the corners of her eyes. She had planned to kill him some day, but this does nicely. Tense negotiations in conference room surrounded by leather-bound precedents. Precedents? The children sitting on either side of their bewildered, wooden mother, their eyes blazing hatred and envy for the luster of her blonde hair, and for what they assume to be the comparative richness of Karen's relationship with their cold, calculating, career-minded father. They want to kill her, but they sit still, as per lawyer's orders, for the money. Another transfer. More promotions, often due to her considerable merits. She rises always, higher and higher. Feeling like two people, but the promotions are something after all, aren't they? Tries a couple of times and nothing, never knowing which of the two cared or could care. And if she doesn't know, the poor men. Transfers away from it twice. Once too soon, once far too late. But, either way, gone from it. A year before trying again. Too little to matter. Another promotion, though. Rising is. To her mother's deathbed. Terminal prognosis, she is told. No hope for me, says mother, adding macabrely that she had been born again. She urges baby to repent. But this sanctimonious bastard padre, who never misses a chance to touch her, however chastely, during her devotions, makes her ill, and she tells him so. Stung, he informs mother that baby's penance is as insincere as the scarlet paint of the harlot she is. Dies mother, slowly and badly, refusing to admit her sinful daughter to the end, on the advice of her priest. Over a year later, pinched with the hardness of despair, she tries it again, and it almost works. His name was Leslie, and he was a lovely man who loved her dearly. In return, she felt a genuine affection. She felt a true warmth. And safe. She felt safe. At the crucial moment, she told Leslie all. He ached with the jolt of her life. He wept. Also, he questioned, over and over. Then he accused. Then he raged, then denounced, then beat her. Then he went. Soon after came another, most important, promotion. Along with it came an offer to be number 2 on a fleet project. A 3-year stretch on an unknown but Earth-like place. Dr. Hollis Ware. The offer is an honor at her age, but no less than she deserved, one way or the other. Still, she didn't want to go, to strand herself 3 years where she could not rise. She put off the decision for weeks, caught between the allure of being, for once, legit, and with the tantalizing momentum of rising is. Without being aware of it, she dreamt of another choice. Then Leslie returned, providing just that. He was tearful and contrite and ashamed, but filled with protestations of hope. She knew his love for her, his heartbreaking devotion to her, was genuine. The next day, in secret, she signed with Hollie. The next month, without warning, she went aloft to sanction. It was, she felt, doing the best thing for the lovely man. He was so sensitive, so easily hurt. He had brought his parents along with him to meet her. She slept at last on my soaked shoulder. I smoked. Sometime in the middle of it she had said, "I know it was all my fault. I guess I'm just no good, like Mother said." I smoked and heard that still expecting to bleed to death from the grinding rasp of those words. I felt numbed by the vice. And then she did an amazing thing. She stirred in her sleep and laughed. Giggled, really, like a little girl. A sweet, safe, beautiful little girl who knew only the blue of the sky and the green grasses and party dresses of pink and blue and white. I reached over carefully and keyed off the last of the light. I doused my cigarette. I lay there. For hours, it seemed, I lay there, my eyes burning in the dark. The next morning, bright and early, I went down and saw Hollie and did the one thing I had been so certain I would never do. I volunteered me. So bizarre. So she's got issues. Big ones. For good reason. She is a badly damaged individual. Understandably so. Chapter 15. Hollie and I sat facing one another on twin loungers. Leia sat at a console between our feet. The suit sat propped at the other. Feeding circuits sprouted everywhere, linking the suit to a couple of other consoles, which were keyed through a massive coil tape, Leia's board, and us. Today was the day. "A couple of things," began Hollie, all businesslike. "Firstly, the raw data." He reached over behind him and keyed something. A small screen lit up with the light green letters against a dark green background. "Name, Felix G. Age 26. Current assignment and rank, Warrior Scout aboard the Starship Terror in deep elliptical around A9. A9? A distant bell rang somewhere. Something I'd seen on the vid? Leia helped me out with, "Banshee." Oh, yeah. Hollie cleared his throat. "More. This takes place, or rather took place, almost exactly 4 standard years ago. Earth date, July 4, 2077. That did ring a bell. Hollie noticed my expression and nodded. "Yes, this is the Independence Day drop, the very first invasion of ant soil. Quite literally, mankind's first step into the ant war." Hollie continued in that efficient way he had, briefly recapping the events surrounding that day. It was hardly necessary. True, I had gone to some trouble in past years to avoid having news of that insanity intruding into my life. But I knew about that day. I remembered it clearly, remembering sitting fixated before the vid like probably every other human in the known worlds. There had been something so spectacular about the events of those first weeks, about the idea of it. Interstellar war. Ants 8 feet tall. Of course it was madness. But in a race where most children grew up playing war, breathtaking fun. It was a good 2 to 3 months before I stopped beginning each day by tuning in news of the ant war. And it wasn't until the end of that first year, that horrible first year which saw over 2 million people wasted, that I turned away, refusing to even listen to ant war conversation. That had been 4 years before. The ant war raged still. I snapped back just in time to hear Hollie's historical wind-up. He ended with a short explanation about why we, about why they, Fleet, had been unable to guide missiles in the Banshee atmosphere of poison and inscrutable magnetic fields. It was stuff I knew, along with the fact that Operation Knuckle, the part involving our scout, was considered a brilliant military victory. Next came a brief recap of stuff I had missed in the few minutes Hollie had already played from the record. Then he gave me the same pre-drop briefing Felix had received, word for word. When he saw my puzzled expression over his perfect recall, he merely shrugged his shoulders and said, "You'll understand in a minute." I clamped down hard on a sudden impulse to shudder. "Now," said Hollie, "how do I know all this? The name G. Felix I got from Fleet Records using his Fleet ID number. The number itself I got by reading it off the inside of his helmet. It's inscribed right between his twin hollows. You'll see it." That scared me. "I'll be able to see through his eyes?" I demanded, appalled. "Not at first," said Hollie quickly. "Never, really." He looked uncomfortable. His eyes stared past me at something within. He frowned, resumed. "The data is neither recorded nor delivered that way. It's not even vaguely photographic, Jack. But after a few minutes, I can't explain exactly." He shrugged again. "You'll see." I would see? Through the eyes, or whatever, of a dead man? This time I did shudder. Laia shifted forward in her chair, moving quickly on. There are a couple of anomalies. First, in the Fleet records, according to them, G. Felix wasn't even there at the time of the battle. At the time of this battle, wasn't even moved to the forward zone until well over 3 months later." I didn't get it. I said so. Laia smiled. "Frankly, neither do we. Confirmation codes didn't exactly clear it up. They did. Fleet Center on Militar, I mean, come back with something about incomplete records on G. Felix and some sort of trouble with them, but that wasn't until months later, as near as we can determine. There was a reference to a security code needed for further data, a rather high code, in fact." "Too high?" I asked. Hollie smiled indulgently. "No, I have it, but I decided not to use it." He looked at the floor, smiled nervously. "Why bother, if I was about to get the truth for myself?" Why indeed, Hollie? Unless you didn't really want to know. Or maybe he didn't want to call attention to himself by invoking a high security clearance? Or unless he had no faith in getting the truth from Fleet at all. No faith, Hollie had said that morning. He had no faith. I searched his uneasily averted gaze. Was he, Super Patriot Fleet scientist, beginning to have doubts? Something was making him all aflutter. I shuddered again. That something would be plain soon enough. "What's the other anomaly?" I wanted to know. Laia shifted in her seat again. I really hated it when she did that. "Well, I'm not entirely certain there is one. It's just that—" She gestured to the coil reel recorder beside her board. "I was able to get a coil of Hollie's experience. Some of it, anyway. His vital signs, respiration, heart rate, acid level, were recorded along with Felix's. Using what I knew about Hollie's history, I was able to filter the two apart. So we know how Felix's body was reacting as well. Nothing unusual there. But," she hesitated, "we also have both sets of Alpha Series brain tracks." She hesitated again. "Felix's were a little odd." "How?" I asked bluntly, not bothering to hide my rapidly growing suspicions. "Well, the Alpha resembles, on first glance, classic textbook symptoms of schizophrenia." "Great!" I snarled angrily. "We're going into the brain of a raving—" Laia held up a hand. On first glance, I said, the pattern, after careful study, misses at several key points. Then he's not mad? I prompted. Or getting there? She looked very uncomfortable. She managed a little something definite in her tone. I don't think he is. She looked at me, her face impassive. I can't be sure, but I don't think so. Then why tell me, goddammit? She looked genuinely surprised. I thought you wanted to know everything. Well, I don't, I snapped. Then, to soften it, I tried a small grin. It seemed to help. She relaxed somewhat. And then, abruptly, it was time. One last check to be sure Laia's monitoring systems were properly keyed in. Another check to see that our dead man switches, to jerk us out in an instant, were functioning. The helmets were lowered over our heads, over our eyes. My last glimpse was of the suit, sitting darkly beside us. It was an impulse I couldn't seem to resist. And then I went to hell. And with that, we're going to call it. That's it for this week. Um, that gets us right to the halfway point of the book. Things are going to escalate rather quickly. As I recall, we have kind of an interregnum, and then we're going to have another shift of perspective. Um, so, hope people are enjoying. It's already been fairly dark, and then things got real dark, up close and personal dark, much in the same way of Lenny Clark in Starfish. Similar damage, although in Lenny Clark's case, spoilers for anyone who hasn't read the trilogy, it was manufactured. Not that she had any control over it, and for her it was very much real. All done in service of making her better at being a deep sea geothermal vent maintenance technician. So, good times that. Grim as they are. I'd say we're probably coming up on them pretty soon. What with the way we keep oh yeah, I'm really going to download an attachment on a message from a number I don't recognize. That's absolutely going to happen. Sure. Um, uh, I don't know. I don't feel like this should be 2077, but the book was written in the mid 80s, so we still had hope back then that we'd get off our collective duffs and start doing stuff in space. Since then, we have very much given up, it seems. And the only people doing it are the people who absolutely should have no business whatsoever doing it. I'd have pushed it out another 2 centuries, probably, maybe, or another at least 100 years, but who knows? Um, so yeah, 2077, July 4th. So remember that every time that you're playing Cyberpunk 2077, you could be fighting ants in the ant war. So there. And dying horribly accordingly. Good times. Just like everyone else. We're going to learn some. The next major chapter chunk is going to be somewhat melodramatic as well. Um, there's a thing that Steakley does that you've probably noticed where he'll repeat certain stanzas or lines over and over and over again, um, like for dramatic emphasis, and it works quite well there. The book flows rather well when the editing is good. And they don't have whatever was going on page. Let me find it again. I didn't dog ear the page, so I have to actually physically find it. Nope, 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 not that chapter. Here we go. Where's the Lewis interaction? Ah, here we go. Oh, no, it wasn't that one. Do 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 do. Oh, come on now. I'll find it again, and it'll make me angry trying to read through it again too. Ah, there it is. I think that's it. Unless it's supposed to read as insanely as it's printed, which I find very difficult to imagine. I think it's on page 165. Oh no, it's right after that. I take it back. Ah, no, here we go. 167. Mm, no, no, it is 165. I'm blind. I think that's it. Anyway, so hopefully people enjoyed. I am going to be gone for next week and probably the week after. I will not be around, so there will be a temporary hiatus for 2 weeks. Other than that, this week on Wednesday, we will be finishing Termush. It's very short. It's like 100 pages. It's a 100-page long novel. It's quite short. And we will also be finishing Destination Void on Friday. Getting through the last chunk of that. When I get back, we will continue with Armor, and we will start on Friday The Three Body Problem by Xixin Liu, and on Wednesday I will figure out what I'm going to be doing, because I don't know. So it might wind up being some short stories or something that I find by trawling my collection slash the Webernet. Goodness knows Project Gutenberg is an excellent resource for such things, as is the Internet Archive. Which reminds me, I have to double check to make sure I got all of the Astounding Science Fictions that somebody had taken the time to upload there. I need to check that. As well as many others. Anyway, with that, I've got to run. I will see you all next time. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hope you enjoyed. I'm going to start a sentence in the middle of a sentence. With that, I'm going to run. I'm going to repeat myself repeatedly, ad nauseum, in fact. And yeah, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I've got to run. Thanks again, and have a good one. I should be back the week of the 19th. I will definitely be back by then. If I am back the week of the 12th, that would be nice too, but I don't know that I will. Anyway, see you all later. Thanks again, and bye. Until next time.